Breaking news today out of Utah. A confession that has reopened the nation's questions and changed the frame of a case that already gripped the public. For weeks, Americans have been trying to understand why Tyler James Robinson allegedly carried out the tragic act that ended the life of Charlie Kirk during a campus event on September 10, 2025. Families have searched for clarity, communities demanded answers, and investigators worked around the clock to connect fragments of a puzzle. Now, in a confession made public in court filings and in messages revealed by prosecutors, Robinson has spoken, and he says he wasn't acting entirely on his own. He claims someone influenced him, pressured him, even sent him. If true, this shifts the case from a single act to a potentially wider network of influence, and it forces us to re-examine everything we thought we knew. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this story is evolving by the day, and you do not want to miss the facts as they emerge. Your support ensures we can continue bringing you verified updates and detailed coverage. From his first appearance, Robinson's contact with investigators and the public was defined by silence. For days after the early September incident, he refused to cooperate with questioning, leaving a void where motive should have been. That silence allowed speculation to spread, online and off, and left grieving families without the answers they desperately wanted. It turned into its own kind of narrative cower, an absence that invited stories, theories, and more questions than facts. But that silence has now shifted into speech, and in that speech, he points outward. He says an idea was planted in him. He says persuasion built over time. He says someone else fed the flame until he acted. Those claims, made publicly during court proceedings and described by prosecutors, complicate a case already heavy with evidence. The specifics included in the public record are stark and immediate. Robinson is charged with aggravated murder and several other felonies. Prosecutors have announced they intend to seek the most serious penalties available. Law enforcement has described how, in the days after the incident, messages and digital footprints surfaced that appeared to document planning and concern about being discovered. Private text to a partner, postings on digital platforms, and exchanges investigators say point toward preparation. Authorities also say he surrendered peacefully after family members helped officials identify him, and the sheriff's office has explained that Robinson feared being shot by law enforcement, which helped shape the manner of his surrender. Those public details give context to his confession, the words of a man who now claims influence placed against evidence that prosecutors say shows deliberate preparation. At the center of this expanded narrative is the confession itself, and our job is to stay focused on it. Robinson's statements, whether delivered in text messages to a partner or recounted in court filings, do not simply say, "I did it." Instead, they emphasize a progression, the planting of an idea, repeated persuasion, a steady pressure that turned thought into action. He describes not a single moment of command, but a relationship of influence that slowly hardened into a decision. Those are the contours of the version he wants the public and the court to hear. They are also the pivot point for defense strategy, an argument that external forces diminished his agency. If the court accepts that framing, the legal implications would be profound. If the court rejects it, the confession will be weighed against a long trail of physical and digital evidence. But as we examine his words, it is crucial to measure them against the digital trail investigators have already disclosed. Prosecutors point to messages on platforms like Discord and private texts where Robinson allegedly discussed plans days earlier, and to actions the state says amount to deliberate preparation, hiding clothing, securing a firearm, and taking steps to avoid detection. These details were cataloged by investigators and outlined in charging documents. The tension between those traces of planning and Robinson's narrative of being influenced is where the case becomes most complex. Is this a confession of truth, or is it a confession that reframes culpability? That is the question the courtroom will soon be asked to resolve. In the courtroom and beyond, reactions have been immediate and polarized. Prosecutors have been explicit in calling the confession part of a defense strategy meant to shift responsibility. Defense attorneys have used Robinson's statements to argue vulnerability and manipulation. Investigators say they must test every claim, follow every lead, and be careful not to let a narrative shape the facts instead of the other way around. Families and community leaders say they want full transparency. They want to know whether this was a single, isolated incident or whether outside influence played a role that might put others at risk. The confession, regardless of motive, guarantees that this inquiry will widen, not narrow. Beyond the courtroom, this moment raises broader societal questions. We live in an era when influence is highly transmissible. Messages travel instantly, online echo chambers can amplify anger, and private communities can reinforce risky views. Robinson's claim of having been influenced points to that broader social dynamic, and it forces a deeper conversation about how vulnerable people may be pushed toward destructive choices. Was the influence subtle and conversational, or was it organized and directed? Did it originate in a private circle, a public feed, or some mixture of both? The answers to those questions matter not only for legal accountability, but for prevention and public safety going forward. We must also recount the timeline that anchors those claims. Charlie Kirk was speaking at an event on September 10th. Within roughly a day, investigators released images and details that led family members and acquaintances to identify Robinson, and authorities took steps that culminated in his peaceful surrender days later. Prosecutors filed charging documents that included alleged messages and a note they say indicated premeditation. Those filings also reference the man's expressed fear of a violent arrest and the manner in which law enforcement handled his surrender. These details help to explain why he was taken into custody without additional incident. This timeline is essential because it sets the factual scaffolding around which Robinson's confession must be evaluated. So, how should the public approach his words? With caution and with scrutiny. Confessions can be truthful, partial, or strategic. In this case, Robinson's claims dovetail with one possible truth, that influence played a real role, but they also stand in tension with clear evidence prosecutors have gathered. The jury of public opinion must not substitute speculation for verifiable fact. That task belongs to the courts, to investigators, and ultimately to forensic analysis and corroborating testimony. Yet we cannot ignore the human element. Robinson's voice, after weeks of silence, gives the grieving family and the public something to examine, something to respond to, and something that might change the legal pathway ahead. While the legal proceedings move forward, the potential ripple effects remain large. If investigators find evidence that corroborates Robinson's claim of outside influence, evidence that shows persuasion, direction, or coordination, then additional charges could follow, and the scope of the case could expand well beyond one defendant. If investigators fail to turn up corroboration, Robinson's words could be seen as an attempt to shift blame. Both outcomes carry deep consequences for the family, for the community, and for the national conversation about influence and responsibility. Every lead must be followed, every communication analyzed, and every possible connection tested against the facts. That's the work ahead for prosecutors and investigators, and for the criminal justice system that must weigh intent against influence. It is also worth noting how this public moment has already influenced behavior elsewhere. In the days since the incident and the ensuing revelations, law enforcement agencies have had to monitor potential copycat threats and related harassment, and officials have moved to secure events and public figures connected with the case. Media organizations and social platforms are grappling with how to report responsibly without amplifying rumors or endangering safety. And families on all sides are bracing for a long legal process in which the danger of misinformation is very real. The confession adds urgency to all of this because it suggests the need for a broader, more careful investigation, one that looks not only for direct orders, but for the quieter forms of persuasion that can steer people toward violence. Looking ahead, the trial will revolve around two competing narratives: the evidence prosecutors have compiled and the version Robinson has provided. The physical and digital traces, messages, notes, items found, and the timeline investigators have established will be presented in court. So too will Robinson's own words and the context in which he made them. The judge, and ultimately a jury, will have to weigh those elements. Did outside influence bear sufficient weight to reduce culpability, or do the preparations and the materials point to deliberate individual intent? The stakes are high, including the possibility that prosecutors will seek the maximum penalties available under state law. That legal reality adds another layer of consequence to every new piece of evidence, every corroborated message, and every witness testimony that emerges. Today, as the public continues to parse the confession, one fact remains constant. Charlie Kirk's death is a wound for many people, family, friends, and a community that must now live with both loss and uncertainty. Tyler Robinson's confession has broken the silence, and while it provides a new narrative, it also creates new demands for thorough